There is a city in the north of England that has been reinvented so many times that most people who visit it now have no idea what was buried in the process. The canals that run through the centre of Manchester were once the arteries of the most productive industrial economy the world had ever seen, carrying cotton and coal, and the wealth of an empire built on labour that the city's mill owners preferred not to discuss too directly. The streets that are now lined with bars and restaurants and converted warehouse apartments were, within living memory, some of the most dangerous and most polluted urban environments in the developed world. The city that markets itself as the home of the Industrial Revolution does not always make clear what the Industrial Revolution cost the people who lived inside it. In this video, we are counting down 13 dark truths about Manchester that the Tourist Board, the City Council, and the heritage industry have been quiet about. Not the Manchester of Oasis and Old Trafford and the Manchester rave scene. The Manchester of the Peterloo Massacre and the body-snatchers and the chemical contamination that is still in the ground and the political cover-up that lasted 30 years. Stay with me to the end, because number one is an event that happened in the centre of this city, in broad daylight, in front of thousands of witnesses, and that the British government suppressed the truth about for longer than almost any other peacetime event in modern British history. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. In 1845, a 24-year-old German named Friedrich Engels published a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. It was based on observations made in Manchester, where Engels had been sent by his father to manage the family's interest in a cotton mill. What Engels found in Manchester's working-class districts, particularly the area of Little Island near Oxford Road and the Ancoats district to the northeast of the centre, was urban poverty of a severity that shocked even an observer prepared to find it. Houses without sanitation, streets without drainage, families living in cellars beneath the waterline of the nearby River Medlock. Children working in the mills at ages that would today constitute child labour with no qualification. Life expectancies in the working-class districts that were a third of those in the middle-class suburbs. Engels documented all of this in precise, specific, named detail. He named the streets, he named the conditions. He produced a record of what Manchester's industrial wealth had built and what it had not built. The mill owners of Manchester were aware of Engels's presence and his observations. They were aware of the book. Their response was not to improve the conditions he documented, but to question his motives. The conditions Engels described in 1845 persisted largely unchanged for decades. Some of the streets he named were not demolished until the 20th century. The Manchester, that is celebrated as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, is the Manchester of the mill owners and the investors. The Manchester that Engels documented, the Manchester of the workers whose labour generated that wealth, is the Manchester that the heritage industry has found harder to integrate into the city's self-presentation. The conditions Engels described were not an unfortunate side effect of industrialization. They were a deliberate outcome of an economic system in which the cost of labour was kept as low as possible and no public money was spent on the welfare of the people whose labour the system required. Manchester had the same problem as Edinburgh. Its medical school needed cadavers, the legal supply was inadequate, and the illegal market filled the gap. The Manchester School of Medicine, established in the early 19th century, required bodies for its anatomy teaching. The legal supply, bodies of executed criminals, was nowhere near sufficient. The result was a body-snatching industry operating in the graveyards of Manchester and its surrounding towns, supplying the medical school with corpses removed from fresh graves. The Manchester body-snatchers were professional operators. They worked the graveyards of the poorer parishes, where the families of the deceased could not afford the watchmen or the iron coffins that protected the graves of the wealthier dead. The Collegiate Church graveyard, which is now Manchester Cathedral, was among the sites targeted. The graveyards of Ardwick and Calton-on-Medlock were regularly worked. The medical school received what the resurrection men supplied and asked limited questions. The Manchester trade in bodies was disrupted but not ended by the Anatomy Act of 1832, which replaced illegal body snatching with the legal acquisition of unclaimed bodies from the workhouses. The poor continued to supply the anatomists through a different mechanism. What changed was the legality. What did not change was the fundamental relationship. The bodies of the poor were used for medical research without consent because the bodies of those who could protect themselves were unavailable. Manchester's medical heritage is celebrated. The supply chain that made it possible is not. On the 16th of August, 1819, approximately 60,000 people gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform. They had come peacefully. They carried banners. They brought their families. The speaker was Henry Hunt, a well-known radical orator who had travelled from London. The local magistrates, watching from a nearby house, decided the crowd was dangerous. They ordered the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, a part-time cavalry force composed of local tradesmen and merchants, to arrest Hunt. The yeomanry rode into the crowd. They were followed by the regular hussars. In the violence that followed, 18 people were killed, and between 400 and 700 were injured, the range reflecting the difficulty of establishing exact figures from contemporary accounts. The name given to the event almost immediately, Peterloo, was a bitter reference to Waterloo, the great British military victory of 4 years earlier. The government of Lord Liverpool responded by congratulating the magistrates. The magistrates were not prosecuted. The yeomanry officers who led the charge were not prosecuted. The newspapers that reported the massacre accurately were prosecuted under the Six Acts. The legislation rushed through Parliament in the aftermath that specifically targeted radical publications. It took until 2019, 200 years after the massacre, for the British government to formally acknowledge that those who died at Peterloo were unlawfully killed. By that time, every person who was there was dead. The Manchester Ship Canal, completed in 1894, was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in Victorian Britain. It connected Manchester directly to the sea, bypassing Liverpool and making Manchester itself a seaport 35 miles inland. It was celebrated as a triumph of northern enterprise and civic ambition. What it required was the destruction of a corridor of communities, farmland, and existing infrastructure along the 35-mile route from Eastham on the Mersey to Manchester's docks at Salford. Approximately 17,000 workers were employed in its construction, known as navvies, living in temporary camps along the route. The conditions in the construction camps were severe. Accidents were frequent. The death toll during construction has never been formally established, with estimates ranging from scores to over 100 workers killed during the 7 years of construction. The communities along the route were disrupted or destroyed by the engineering work, which required the compulsory purchase of land and the rerouting of roads, railways, and watercourses across the entire 35-mile corridor. The canal was built at a financial cost that almost bankrupted Manchester and a human cost that was never comprehensively audited. When it opened, it was celebrated. The navvies who built it, the communities it disrupted, and the workers who died in its construction were not prominently featured in the opening ceremony attended by Queen Victoria in May 1894. Manchester and its surrounding towns were at the centre of the British chemical industry throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The dyestuffs, bleaches, and industrial chemicals required by the cotton and textile industries created a cluster of chemical manufacturing operations across the region. The chemical industry that supplied Manchester's mills also left behind a legacy of contaminated land that has never been fully remediated. Sites across Salford, Runcorn, Widnes, and the wider Manchester region contain elevated levels of heavy metals, industrial solvents, and chemical residues from over a century of manufacturing operations. The health consequences of living adjacent to chemical manufacturing operations were known in general terms before they were specifically documented. The communities that lived nearest to the chemical plants were the communities that could not afford to live elsewhere. The relationship between industrial pollution and public health in the Manchester region was the subject of public health investigations throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The investigations found what they found. The chemical industry continued, the contamination accumulated. When the chemical plants eventually closed, the land they left behind did not become clean. It became derelict. Some of it has subsequently been developed for housing. The question of what the ground beneath some Manchester region housing developments contains has never been comprehensively and publicly answered. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Manchester became the centre of a musical and cultural movement that the media called Madchester. The Haçienda nightclub, the bands that played there and were shaped by the scene around it, the specific energy of a northern city reinventing itself culturally after the devastation of deindustrialization, produced a moment of genuine creative vitality that has been extensively documented and celebrated. What has been less extensively examined is the economic foundation of the Haçienda itself. The Hacienda was funded by Factory Records, which was funded by the success of New Order, which itself operated on margins that kept the club financially precarious throughout its existence. The club's financial model was partly sustained by the drug economy that the scene generated, both directly through the spending of clubbers who were using MDMA and other substances, and indirectly through the protection money that the Manchester criminal gangs who controlled the drug supply to the club extracted from its management. By the early 1990s, the gang presence in and around the Hacienda had become so significant that the club was effectively operating under the protection of criminal organizations. The management eventually closed the club in 1997, citing the gang problem directly. The Hacienda has been celebrated as one of the great cultural spaces of 20th century Britain. The criminal economy that sustained and ultimately destroyed it is part of the story that the cultural celebration tends to minimize. On the 15th of June, 1996, the Provisional IRA detonated a bomb in Manchester city centre that was at the time the largest bomb detonated in Great Britain since the Second World War. The bomb, weighing approximately 1,500 kilograms, exploded near the Marks and Spencer store on Corporation Street. Over 200 people were injured. The evacuation that preceded the detonation, prompted by a warning call, meant that no one was killed. The physical damage to the city centre was enormous. Significant sections of the retail and commercial core were destroyed or severely damaged. The subsequent redevelopment of the bomb-damaged area transformed Manchester city centre in ways that urban planners and city councils had been seeking to achieve for decades, but had been unable to fund or politically justify. The Arndale Centre was rebuilt and extended. Corporation Street was redesigned. The area around the Exchange Square became one of the most significant public spaces in the north of England. The regeneration that the bomb forced was achieved in ways and at a scale that the pre-bomb planning processes had not been able to deliver. This is not to suggest that the bomb was beneficial. 200 people were injured. The trauma to the city was real. But the relationship between the destruction caused by the bomb and the urban transformation that followed, and specifically the question of which commercial and development interests benefited most directly from the redevelopment that the bomb made possible, is a question that has never been the subject of a comprehensive independent analysis. Manchester has had one of the most significant rough sleeping populations in England outside London throughout the 21st century. The causes of Manchester's homelessness crisis are multiple and well documented: welfare reform, inadequate social housing provision, mental health service cuts, and the specific character of a city that has attracted large numbers of people seeking work without always being able to provide for those who do not find it. What belongs in this video is a specific chapter of that story. The clearances of homeless encampments from Manchester's railway arches and city centre underpasses that occurred across the period from approximately 2015 to 2020. Homeless people who had established encampments in the railway arches around Piccadilly and in the underpasses of the Inner Ring Road were moved on by British Transport Police and Greater Manchester Police, their possessions in some cases removed or destroyed. The clearances were accompanied by the installation of hostile architecture in the cleared spaces: metal spikes, curved benches designed to prevent sleeping, railings across formerly accessible shelter spaces. The clearances and the hostile architecture installation were not accompanied by a corresponding increase in shelter provision. The people who were moved from the railway arches did not move into housing. They moved to other locations. The clearances were conducted, in some cases, immediately before significant political or ceremonial events in the city. raising the question of whether the management of visible homelessness in Manchester has at times been more about managing appearances than managing the underlying crisis. And hey, before we reach the final three, if this video is showing you a Manchester that the city's promotional materials have been consistently careful around, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks they know this city. Because what follows is the part of Manchester's story that the Northern Powerhouse narrative has had the most difficulty incorporating. Now, let's continue. Ordsall is a neighbourhood in Salford, the city that borders Manchester to the west, and that the Greater Manchester conurbation has largely absorbed. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Ordsall experienced a level of gang-related gun violence that placed it, per capita, among the most dangerous neighbourhoods in England. The Salford gang conflicts of this period, which involved the Ordsall crew and other organised criminal groups, produced a sustained period of shootings, stabbings, and gun-related violence that received relatively limited national media coverage compared to comparable levels of violence in London. The reasons for this disparity in coverage are debated. What is documented is that Salford and Ordsall experienced serious gang violence during a period when the city region was actively marketing itself as a destination for business investment and media industry relocation. The BBC's decision to relocate to Media City at Salford Quays, adjacent to the affected areas, coincided with a period during which the Salford gang conflict was at its most intense. The relationship between the city region's marketing of itself and its management of information about the gang violence occurring within it is a question that has been raised by journalists, but never the subject of a formal investigation. Manchester United supporters have a complicated relationship with the Hillsborough disaster. This is not the place to examine that relationship in its full cultural complexity, and this is not a video about football. But there is a specific dimension of the Hillsborough story that has a Manchester connection that is rarely made explicit. The misinformation campaign that followed Hillsborough, the false allegations that Liverpool supporters were responsible for the crush, the narrative that was disseminated through the press, and that South Yorkshire police worked to establish, found a receptive audience in some sections of Manchester that should have known better. The specific rivalry between Manchester United and Liverpool, which is one of the most intense in English football, created conditions in which some elements of the Hillsborough misinformation were adopted and amplified in Manchester contexts long after the truth had been established. The Manchester Evening News, which is the principal newspaper of the city, has a relationship with the Hillsborough story that does not reflect well on its performance during the period when the misinformation was being established. The broader question of how Manchester as a city related to the Hillsborough Truth campaign and to the families of the dead is a question that is rarely asked in the positive terms in which Manchester usually discusses its relationship with Liverpool. Manchester is not the villain of the Hillsborough story, but it is not a neutral party either, and the honest account of the city's relationship with that story is more complicated than the city's self-image generally acknowledges. Between approximately 2000 and 2012, a network of men operating primarily in Rochdale and other Greater Manchester towns systematically groomed and sexually exploited young girls, most of them from the care system or from vulnerable family backgrounds, most of them between the ages of 12 and 16. The Rochdale grooming gang scandal, as it became known, was not unique to Rochdale or to Greater Manchester. Similar networks were operating in Rotherham, Derby, Oxford, and other towns. But the Greater Manchester element of the scandal has a specific dimension that distinguishes it from some other cases. Greater Manchester Police received reports about the exploitation of the young women in Rochdale years before the first prosecutions were brought. Social services in the affected areas received reports. The reports were not acted upon with the urgency they required. The prosecutions that eventually occurred in 2012 followed an investigation that had been significantly delayed. The reasons for the delay, including the same institutional reluctance identified in Rotherham to be seen to be targeting a specific community, have never been the subject of a comprehensive independent investigation specific to Greater Manchester. 9 men were convicted in 2012. Subsequent investigations have convicted additional perpetrators. The question of what happened in the years between the first reports and the first prosecutions, who received those reports, what decisions were made about them, and whether a more urgent response would have prevented harm to additional victims, is a question that Greater Manchester Police has never been required to answer in the same public forum that the J report created for Rotherham. We began this video with the Peterloo Massacre. We end with what happened after it. Not the massacre itself, but the government's response, which represents one of the most systematic suppressions of a public event in British political history. On the 16th of August 1819, the government of Lord Liverpool received word of what had happened at St. Peter's Field. Within days, it had sent a formal message congratulating the Manchester magistrates for their response to what it characterised as a threat to public order. The Home Secretary, Viscount Sidmouth, wrote personally to the magistrates expressing the Prince Regent's approval. The newspapers that reported accurately on the massacre were targeted. The journalists and editors who wrote about what actually happened at St. Peter's Field faced prosecution under existing laws and then under the new legislation rushed through Parliament in December 1819, the Six Acts, which specifically targeted radical publications. The witnesses who gave evidence of what they had seen were discredited. The inquest into the deaths returned verdicts that did not support prosecution of the yeomanry. The legal proceedings that followed acquitted those who had carried out the attack on the crowd. For generations, the official British position was that what had happened at Peterloo was a regrettable but necessary response to a dangerous situation. It took 200 years, until 2019, for the British government to formally acknowledge that the people who were killed at Peterloo were unlawfully killed. The magistrates who ordered the cavalry into the crowd were never prosecuted. The officers who led the charge were never prosecuted. The government that congratulated the perpetrators was never held accountable. The Six Acts that targeted the journalists who told the truth were repealed eventually, but the journalists prosecuted under them received no posthumous justice. Peterloo happened in Manchester. The suppression of the truth about Peterloo happened in Westminster, and the 200 years between the event and the formal acknowledgement represent one of the longest sustained cover-ups of a peacetime atrocity in the history of British governance. The people who were there are all dead. The city that it happened in has grown around the site. The square where it occurred is now used for Christmas markets and civic ceremonies and protest rallies, which is, in the most bitterly appropriate way possible, exactly what it was being used for on the 16th of August, 1819, before the cavalry arrived.